Hi, my name is Lindy Jung. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer, and I make videos about writing, books, travel, and pretty much whatever else I feel like. Today I wanted to dive into a writing topic that I just personally find kind of interesting. It's this terminology of planner, pantsers, and planters, and these ideas that there are three types of drafting styles, or three types of writers, and that we all fall into one of these three types. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I do want to dive into this because I feel like it can be helpful to examine the strengths and weaknesses of each type of writer and sort of figure out what you can utilize from each style, basically. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. To start with, I'm just going to go over the three types just in case you aren't familiar with them or just need a little bit of clarification. These are words that get thrown around a lot, especially on like social media writing spaces. I remember the first time I encountered them, I was like, okay, that probably makes sense, but I don't think I understand what a pantser is. So, a planner or a plotter, I think I see both kind of used interchangeably, is someone who is very meticulous about their writing. It's someone who has a really detailed outline that they're more or less following all the way through as they undergo the drafting process. That means that the planning or outlining stage will probably be longer and more intensive for them than the drafting stage might be, and that means they're not necessarily going to want to divert from the path that they've chosen for themselves. They're gonna pretty much stick to the story they have in mind. A pantser is someone who flies by the seat of their pants, which is not a term or phrase that I'd heard before its association with this type of writer. This is someone who's basically winging it. They may have an outline, they may not. Either way, they're probably not going to stick to it super closely, and that line is more likely to be a little bit looser. Most pantsers have a general idea of where their story is going as they're writing it. They just don't necessarily know all of the steps to get there, and they don't have a super detailed idea of the plot. They're sort of discovering the story as they write it. A plantser is somewhere in between the two. It's a combination of the words plotter and pantser, or maybe planner and pantser. I've never really been clear on which one gave the L to that word. Anyway, these folks work somewhere in the gray area between these two direct opposites, so they most likely have some sort of outline. It probably won't be as detailed as a planner's might be, but they're definitely they have at least a save the cat beat sheet to work off of, you know? But even if they do have an outline, they might not necessarily stick to it. They're probably more willing to follow the rabbit, as some people might say, follow those plot bunnies to new and interesting places as the drafting process kind of proceeds. I'd say that most people are like this. I think this is the most normal thing to be, is to have a plan, but to be flexible about it. I honestly think that we can be planners or we can be pantsers, and it just sort of depends on the project. Like, for example, if you're writing a mystery or a thriller, you kind of want to be a planner, but I don't want to, just start talking when I have this whole structured outline thing to go off of. Oh my god, I was a planner for this video. So as you can probably tell, there are a bunch of very specific weaknesses associated with each of these styles of writing. To start off with our planners, our friends, the planners, I can tell if someone is a planner or if someone's really sticking to their preconceived outline because their writing feels a little bit stiff. It feels a little bit paint by numbers. They might be an underwriter. I feel like when I am really, really rigid about my planning stage, I tend to underwrite my books even more than I usually do. Also, it makes it more difficult to do developmental edits if your outline is super tight beforehand. There is like a pro and a con here. Like, on one hand, you might need less developmental edits, but if there's something you didn't catch while you were in the outlining phase and you sort of like structured your outline regardless of, or with that in mind, with that key error or just element that doesn't really work with the rest of the story, then if you pull on that one thread, the rest of it might really fall apart. Basically, it just makes change really difficult, and change is crucial in many parts or stages of writing. Not having that flexibility is going to be the biggest detriment to a planner. Also, there's just this issue of your story mostly being like conceived and planned out in the outlining stage. It's harder to see the forest for all the trees in outlining stage, I feel like. I will often have a really tight outline. I would not necessarily categorize myself as a strict planner. I'm more of like a planning heavy plantser. There's story elements that might not work with the rest of the story that I don't catch until I'm in the drafting phase. And again, it just becomes harder and harder to like remove that element from the story once you hit developmental edits. Also, I do think flexibility is a strength. I think that being able to come up with stuff as you're going along or coming up with novel elements as you're actually drafting, that's like the really fun part of writing for me, especially as a speculative fiction writer. I just sort of like come up with these little details of magic or world building, etc. as I go along. They're not all conceived from the start of the outlining process. I think this also holds true when it comes to character backstories. Like, I might not necessarily know every detail of why a character is behaving the way they are. This is especially held true for me as I'm writing my sort of like dark academia mystery novel, because all of the characters coming into it have a secret that they're like really closely guarding. And I didn't necessarily come up with the backstory for one of the characters out of the 5. I just knew what his secret was, and now that I'm like going into that, it just explains so much of his behavior. It's sort of like being able to like retcon some of what he does. I have to go back and plant those seeds early on. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, just being able to go back and like shift things around is very useful. Now for our pantser friends. I can usually tell if someone's a pantser if their pacing's a little bit wonky or if there's not enough structure. I don't believe in too much structure. I don't believe in religiously following writing structure guidelines because that would be very silly. All of our stories would be the same. But if there's a pacing issue, I definitely think that, going back to 3x structure and figuring out what beats to hit, that's very useful. Plots can meander. It can feel like you're sort of losing the point a lot of the time or going off in random directions, which is fine. I feel like that can make a story exciting, but if it's too much, then I'm like, okay, this person pantsed this draft and has to go back and do some significant developmental edits. That being said, this person is also usually going to be an overwriter, so someone who uses too many words to describe what they're doing or just way overshoots their word count or just needs to ultimately in the end pare back on their word count. All of this means that there's going to be a lot of editing to do in the revisions process, which there's nothing wrong with that. I personally love revisions. It's probably my favorite part of writing a book, but this can be frustrating and it can slow you down, especially because I feel like a lot of pantsers tend to be quite fast drafters, which sort of just compounds on these existing issues. So what does that result in? That results in some messy feeling stories with a lot of plot points that may not connect so smoothly. It can mean stories that don't necessarily have a clear theme from the beginning. You might have to revise with theme in mind. Character arcs might drop off, meander. It might be harder to keep track of certain things like recurring characters or subplots. They just might sort of be forgotten as the writer is barreling forward to just keep writing, keep the draft going. So if you're a pantser, you're really going to need to develop a keen editorial eye. You're going to have to know your strengths and weaknesses because you're sort of going based off of instinct. You're going to have to intrinsically understand what you tend to underwrite or overwrite or leave by the wayside. For example, for me, if I am sort of pantsing a draft more, like with this dark academia book that I've been working on, I've been pantsing in terms of Act 2, because I know very much the beginning and the end. I know what the mystery elements are. And it's just a little bit more of that like investigation. Like I know what beats I'm hitting, there's just some filler in between that I've been pantsing. So I've been filling that in with a lot of discovery writing, especially when it comes to my characters with their secrets. So I know I'm gonna have to go ahead and be like killing my darlings throughout the revisions process. There is a lot of filler in there, but it's helped me sort of build upon and get to know my characters more so I can move into the actual relevant scenes with those traits in mind. That being said, I had a clear idea of my ending, and I think that's really important for pantsers. I think knowing your endpoint is at like a bare minimum sort of thing, and I know a lot of people who don't really know their ending when they go into writing a book, which I think can be an issue, honestly. I think it's very noticeable when you're just sort of like meandering, like I said, and it's really hard to pull together a completed manuscript that doesn't go anywhere or ends abruptly. I think a large part of this is because an ending and theme, like thematic resonance, are so closely linked. You have to sort of understand the theme of your story to write a good, compelling ending, and that can be hard if you don't really know where the story is going to go when you start out. Another thing that I feel like pantsers need to watch out for is inconsistencies. This is pretty minor, and it is one of those things that gets picked up in revisions, but in my days of pantsing books, I would literally like introduce characters and then forget that they exist or forget their relevance to the story. This was when I was like much younger, but stuff like that you just sort of have to keep an eye out for. I think it's helpful to go back and reread what you've written regularly just so you're kind of on top of yourself, if that makes sense. Now going into plantsers. Being a plantser is a spectrum. There are definitely people who are a lot more planner leaning and people who are a lot more pantser leaning. I feel like these words are starting to not feel real. Not that they were that real to begin with, but they're just starting to feel ridiculous in my mouth. Anyway, plantsers run into issues pretty commonly, such as I feel like hesitancy starting a project, having too many projects going on at once, stopping and starting projects, or maybe that's just me. I kind of think these are universal writing issues as well, but there is definitely an association between being a plantser who has a really good spark of an idea that's like slightly developed and you feel like you're ready to go ahead and draft it and then hitting a wall because you haven't planned enough, or just like sort of losing track of that and having a new idea and developing that just a little bit and then going into that. It feels like very frenetic to me, just living this life. And I think because we start with looser ideas and looser outlines and less structure, it's easy for things to fall apart. It's easy to be like, oh, I did not sort of think this through before I jumped into the drafting phase, and this story doesn't actually hold the promise that I thought it would. Also because outlines sort of tend to change, not outlines, that's not really the right word, but plots and plot ideas and plot trajectory tends to sort of change in the drafting process. It's sort of easy to lose the thread of a story, which leads to weakening of the theme and weakening of character arcs and just weakening of those sort of like underlying things that make a story really powerful and compelling. Because your outline tends to be pretty fast and loose and not super structured unless you're more planner leaning. That means that you're going to end up suffering from the same sort of issues that a pantser might. I'm now starting to mix them up. That a pantser might. But at the same time, if you're a little stricter on yourself like the planner, it can be hard to pivot once you've begun. It's just the same issues, but a little bit less dramatic. The thing to do as a plantser is, I think, to one, understand which side you sort of lean more toward and to curb your instincts, and to sort of like pick an outline and stick with it and develop that as much as you can handle, as much as you can stand before you actually jump into the drafting process. I think for plantsers, writing just becomes a very non-linear process. Same for pantsers a little bit. You just end up sort of drafting to draft to feel out the story, to see how you feel writing it, and then you sort of go from there. But that is sometimes a waste of time. I think in my personal experience, I've definitely wasted time trying to feel out a project, or I've been like, okay, this is developed enough, pitched it, and then started writing it and then not liked it at all. So yes, at the end of the day, just understanding your weaknesses, your strengths, that's all you can really do as a plantser. That's all we can do as writers in general. So I guess there is nothing else to do here. No, there's definitely stuff to talk about. I'm just gonna talk. I think a big takeaway here is that there's no one perfect way to write. There is no holy grail perfect type of writer, and I think that's why it's so important to go through and finish writing books and go through the process of revising them and looking back on your work and understanding your work. I didn't realize this before, but a lot of people will draft a book and then be done with it. And while that's totally respectable, and if you're not in pursuit of publishing traditionally or self-publishing or any of that stuff, then that is within your rights. You can absolutely do that. But I think if you want to develop as a writer, you definitely have to go through the process of revisions, however much it sucks, even if you hate it, because there's just so much you can learn from editing your own writing and looking back at your own writing and even being super hard on yourself. I know it doesn't feel great, but revising is such a critical part of growing as a writer, and revising your own work and understanding your flaws and your strengths and everything in between is just super important. And this is especially particularly true if you are planning to pursue traditional publishing in any way. You're going to end up revising your work until you're sick to death of it, so it's better to just learn how to do it and learn how to do it efficiently. I think the only reason I've been able to stomach traditional publishing so far is because I actually kind of enjoy revising quite a bit, and if it were any other way, I would not be having that much fun with it. I mean, I'm not having that much fun with it now, but I definitely would not have stuck with it this long. Anyway, that was a little spiel about revising. I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I've been stuck in the process of drafting 2 books when I really just want to be revising. So conclusions. Thinking about what this means for us as writers. Again, just identifying what you are and what your flaws are and all of that. I also, like I said, think that this is something that is very flexible. I definitely have planned books a little bit better, and I have definitely pantsed books a little bit more than the ones I'm currently working on. In my tenure as a writer, I have slowly transitioned from pantser when I was a lot younger and just writing for fun, to a planner when I was starting to take writing a lot more seriously and was learning about things like 3-act structure and Save the Cat and all of those story basics for pretty much the first time. Now I'm settling into my life as a plantser because I'm a little bit more comfortable with those story structure basics, and I don't have to necessarily write them out every time to understand what beats I'm going to hit and when. I have a better grasp of pacing just because I've written enough at this point that I understand what pacing that is decent feels like as I write it. And I like to have fun by discovering things. I honestly was super stressed out as a planner or a plotter. I did the note card thing. I still do that once in a while. I should probably do it again for the young adult urban fantasy I have planned. I think this is sort of the natural settling point for more experienced writers. I mean, I don't consider myself super experienced by any stretch of the imagination, but as someone who has been writing for a decent amount of time and has a couple of books under their belt, it's definitely where I feel the most comfortable. I have kind of settled into my process. I trust myself a little bit more, and I know what instincts to follow and when to not follow those instincts, and to actually like sit down and think through the story structure and think through characterization and motivation and goals and conflict and all that. And I also know that a lot can be fixed during revisions, but not everything. So if you feel like you're stuck as a planner or as a pantser and you kind of don't want to be that way anymore, just keep writing, I guess, and then you'll get to a point where your process feels intuitive enough that maybe you'll be more comfortable as a pantser. It's also been helpful for me to sort of approach my stories piecemeal. Like, for example, if you are a really avid planner and you're sort of stuck on a scene, then try pantsing it and discovering through your writing what direction that scene should take or what tone it should have. I've definitely been doing more and more of that. Like, if I feel like the scene that I had written out in my outline or in my head was a little bit boring, then I might pants it a little bit just to add some juice, add some sauce, add some flavor. And vice versa, if you are a pantser and you feel like you're not going anywhere with your story, then it's definitely a good idea to take a step back and plan or outline or sketch out some ideas before you go ahead. Like, you know, I've heard of people doing this for the chapter they're gonna write the next day. Like, they might spend one day pantsing, and then if they hit a wall, just sort of briefly outline the next couple chapters and then go back to pantsing. Whatever works for you, experiment, try around, do what feels right, follow your instincts but not too much, and yeah, happy writing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you guys next time.